Councillors, welcome, and Ms Davidson, very much welcome. Oh, I got that wrong. Never mind. Right. I will start with apologies for absence and substitutions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Apologies this evening are submitted on behalf of Councillor Fowler, and Councillor Davidson is substituting for her, and also apologies from your Vice Chairman, and Councillor Harris is substituting for Councillor Fairley.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. Welcome, Councillor Davidson, and welcome, Councillor Harris. Very much appreciate you stepping in at the last minute. Right, item 2, minutes of the last meeting. May I sign these as a true record? Thank you very much. Yep. Any matters arising from those minutes? I have none. Thank you. Declarations of interest. Ms. Councillor Bush. Sorry.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, obviously District Councillor for the Oakleys and Wicks, and also Parish Councillor for Great Oakley too.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bush. Questions on item 4, questions on notice pursuant to council procedurals.
We have one received for this meeting, Chairman, and Councillor Coley is in attendance to read his question out.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. Councillor Coley, would you like to read it out? Thank you very much. You're on.
Chairman, I presume you have the supporting documentation. Thank you. My question is, would it result in a greater level of general compliance if planning officers drew all developers' attention to their legal requirements regarding the placing of advertising signs, etc., and make compliance with all aspects of these regulations standard planning conditions? My second part is the Secretary of State can suspend or remove permanently deemed consent in a particular area on a request from a local authority. Should TDC not consider such an application in respect of sensitive conservation areas at least?
Thank you very much, Councillor Coley. Thank you for your question. Your ward has been radically changed before we could get the district plan in. And although the question isn't strictly pertinent to our business tonight, it is pertinent to the development in the district and how it is managed. And this reflects on our future planning policy, which this committee will be obviously looking at the 5-year review, which is 4.5 years away, 4 3/4 years away. And so therefore I take the question. And plus, I don't think there's another format where ward councillors can bring their pertinent problems to the attention. Thank you. I will give the response I've been given. The town, and this is complicated, the Town and Country Planning Control of Advertisements England Regulations 2007 and Circular March 07 Town and Country Planning Control of Advertisements England Regulation 2007 detail the advert regulations. On this basis, deemed consent is available across the district for adverts, and this includes those available to developers who may wish to advertise the routes to get to their site and on-site advertising of their development. In respect of question 1, failure to comply with the requirements of the advertisement regulations can be reported to our enforcement team for them to investigate. This would include enforcement of 5 standard conditions under said regulations that would apply in all cases. In summary, these refer to ownership, endangerment of the highway, visual amenity, maintained in a condition not to endanger the public, and restoration of sites. Making developers more aware of advert regulations when dealing with planning applications for other development may be helpful to applicants and developers, perhaps as a further informative note. Further awareness could be a consideration for the future website review and pre-application reasonable or possible to condition adverts when they are not part of the proposal before the local planning authority to consider, and or not part of the application site to reasonably control in some cases. However, it is often a need to control construction management of a development site to protect amenity, and this may include an understanding of routes options for construction development. It may be possible to add to the standard condition for said management for the inclusion of directional signs that may be reasonable. In respect of question 2, the Secretary of State can restrict deemed consent for adverts in an area. The government guidance is available on this point, but in summary, quote, it must be that provisions has had such adverse effects on the amenity or public safety of the area that there is no prospect of an improvement in quality of advertising in the locality unless the local planning authority is given power to control that particular type of advertisement. End of quote. Accordingly, it is unlikely that blanket restriction would be successful and evidence for certain areas in these terms would be needed. Historic interests in respect of the conservation areas are not a specific criteria in this matter, but it is noted conservation areas already means adverts are restricted in those areas. In addition, the Secretary of State must publicise a local planning authority's proposal for any restriction, allow an opportunity for representations to be made and taken into account. This may result in a publication of the proposal and public hearing to examine the proposal and any representations. If successful, the details of the directions must be published and those owners occupiers displaying advertisements which are affected by the direction in the areas must be notified. Accordingly, there is a process for such request, but resource, evidence and reasonable justification would be required to seek such a restriction, and such evidence is not considered to be available at this time. In summary, question 1. Making developers more aware of advert regulations when dealing with planning applications for other development may be helpful to applicants and developers, perhaps as further informative notes. Further awareness could be a consideration of the future website review and pre-application discussions. It would not be reasonable or possible to condition adverts when they are not part of the proposal before the local planning authority to consider, and or not part of an application site, reasonable control in some cases. Question 2. The Secretary of State can restrict deemed consent for adverts in an area. The government guidance is available on this point, but in summary, it must be clear that one or more of the deemed consent provisions has had such adverse effects on the amenity or public safety of that area, there is no prospect of an improvement in the quality of advertising in the locality unless the local planning authority are given the power to control that type of advertisement. There is a process for such requests, but evidence and reasonable justification would be required to seek such a restriction, and such evidence is not considered to be available at this time. End of answer. I leave you to draw the bones out of that, and I'd like papers on my desk tomorrow morning. Thank you very much. Do you have a supplementary question, Councillor Coley?
I do, Chairman, if you'll permit me.
Of course I will.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm grateful for the response and I accept the comments to question 2. However, I have a supplementary question for clarification regarding the advice in the response related to question 1. I quote, failure to comply with the requirements of the advertisement regulations can be reported to our enforcement team for them to investigate. Surely this is perverse in the extreme and the reverse of what should legally occur. There is no evidence that developers ever comply with these legal responsibilities. Likewise, there is no evidence to suggest that this council ever does anything about it. Conversely, 3 days ago, planning officers approved an application for 18 flags and poles outside a development in my ward, when the legal limit is for 3. The reply to my question is suggesting that TDC continues to acquiesce and collaborate with the developers, flouting the regulations. Watch while they illegally fix signs and flags everywhere. Then after that's done, members report the blatant transgression to TDC planning enforcement, which will presumably apply their own harm matrix and do nothing about it. As stated, the regulations do allow some deemed consent, but only providing that the developer has complied with their legal responsibilities. Developer compliance would allow some level of control rather than the proliferation of signs and flags which currently blight our environment. Members, this council is already considered by developers as a soft touch in all areas of planning enforcement. What I'm suggesting is that compliance with the advertisement regulations, the details of which you've heard, may be a formal planning condition, routinely set by committee and officers. In that way, compliance may be more concentrated in the minds of the developers and breaches could be more effectively controlled. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Councillor Curley. Do you wish to respond to that, or would you prefer to do it later in writing? Yes, certainly, Mr. Guyver. Mr. Guyver.
Thanks very much, Councillor Curley. Probably just a couple of things I would say in response to that. And I think the points raised are completely understood. In terms of utilising a formal planning condition to control advertising in this respect, I think the point in the response that makes that difficult is if those adverts fall beyond the boundary of the application sign, then it doesn't fall upon the local authority to be able to control them legally through planning conditions. But the suggestion that information is provided as part of the construction methods plan that we have to sign off, I think is one point at which we can actually have that dialogue with the developer and sign off what they're proposing to do, but it would still allow them to put signs up in accordance with the regulations. In response to the point about when we do have these signs up, the council aren't following up and ensuring that there is compliance with the regulations. Again, it's one of those areas around enforcement where if they are reported to the council, we can investigate and take the appropriate action. In some cases, it might be deemed under harm assessment that, yes, we should take action and request that they're taken down. In other cases, that level of harm won't quite reach the threshold to require expedient action. But as you'll be aware, Councillor Coley, there is a task and finish group that is looking at enforcement as a general subject, and I think all members have been invited by the chairman of that task and finish group to put forward their concerns, observations around planning enforcement, and if members in other wards have similar issues in their areas, as you have, Councillor Coley, then it provides a good opportunity for them to report them to us as well. But I hope that helps for now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Guyver. I will ask this to save any future work or increase future work. Are you satisfied with that, Councillor Coley?
Yeah, I am.
Or would you prefer a written answer as well?
I understand exactly what Mr. Guyver has said. I am frustrated that our own planning department gives a planning approval for 18 signs when the regulations say they can only have 3. I am frustrated by that.
I fully understand. I have something that's occurred in my ward, or just my next door ward, this morning along the very same lines. But what I will do is I will ask Mr. Ford here to draw the minutes of this committee to the attention of the portfolio holder for planning. Okay, thank you. Public speaking. number 5. Mr. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Marshall, would you care to join us?
Good evening, and thank you for allowing me to comment on this agenda item. Some 9 months ago, I repeated to Mr. Guyver the fact that the newly adopted development plan was preventing small-scale windfall sites coming forward and to be approved. The lack of these sites was affecting the local small-scale builders stroke developers. There are now more local builders and developers scratching around for work and sites to carry on working far into the new year. Committee and officers will be aware in the Section 2 Planning Inspector's report dated the 24th of November 21, paragraph 35, it states the approach taken to development outside settlement boundaries is unduly restrictive and so conflicts with the National Planning Policy Framework. Could this be urgently addressed? Officers have stated that there were 777 completions for 21-22, and the target is 550 dwellings per annum. However, the 550 is a minimum target. There is no maximum. Out of the 770, only 5 completions were registered on small-scale sites in Ardleigh. However, many more of these sites in Ardleigh could come forward if the planning system was more favourable to them. The government has stated it wants growth, especially in housing. And Fox Street, DRPP, is shovel-ready, subject to tendering planning's favourable response. Ardleigh is an up-and-coming place, and just last month, Councillor Harris there promoted the Surya Foods and got it through the planning committee, and people will need to fill those jobs in that location, and we need more people in Ardleigh, Fox Street. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marshall. Did you wish?
Chairman, if I can pick up some of Mr. Marshall's points as part of my presentation on A1, I'll pick them up there. Thank you.
That's fine. Thank you very much, Mr. Guyver. Right, number 6. We have before us tonight some excellent news regarding the updated housing supply position and the housing trajectory. I will not steal Mr. Guyver and his team's thunder. Mr. Guyver.
Thank you, Chairman. So it's a requirement of national planning policy for local authorities such as ourselves to plan for future growth in housing based on projected growth in the population. We do that through making allocations through our local plan, which we recently adopted earlier in the year, and by ensuring and monitoring delivery against the requirements of the local plan and maintaining a 5-year supply of housing land going forward. Those checks and balances are in place, one, to ensure that local authorities contribute towards the delivery of housing that's required nationally and in their area, but also to ensure that in the event that delivery falls below target and the council is left in a position where it cannot identify a supply of land for housing going forward, there are requirements in national policy that then require the council to consider development sites outside of the local plan that would not normally be considered favourable, and that's what we call the presumption in favour of sustainable development and the tilted balance. And for a number of years, Chairman, of course, we were caught in that position where we were needing to approve or recommend approval for applications outside of our local plan, and we didn't have an up-to-date local plan in place. That situation is not the situation we find ourselves in now, and I'm happy to be able to report the latest housing figures to you. So in terms of the delivery of housing in the financial year 2021-22, the net increase in housing stock was 777 units. So that is comfortably above the 550 a year requirement in the local plan, and represents continued performance above that requirement. Mr. Marshall is absolutely correct that 550 is not a ceiling on development. That is a minimum, but the way that we have dealt with that through the local plan is we haven't treated it as a minimum, as a ceiling. We have treated it as a minimum, and through the local plan, you'll recall when that went to full council, we had over allocated by around 1,600 homes to ensure that there was a degree of flexibility, just in case certain sites didn't come forward at the speed that was expected. So 777 dwellings in 2021-22. Last year, you'll recall that we had a deficit in housing delivery that had built up since 2013, where for the first 3 years of our local plan period from 2013, we'd actually delivered beneath that requirement. But since then, delivery has been well above. And if I can draw your attention to the figures on page 19 of the printed agenda, just at the top of the page there, you'll see that there were 3 years where delivery was well below the requirements, but in subsequent years, delivery has been just above or well above that requirement. And such that now this year we actually have a surplus of delivery above the 550 requirement of 111 dwellings. So I think some interesting figures there. 777 achieved this year. We had a deficit of 666 last year, and now we have a surplus of 111. It sounds a bit like a game of bingo in some respects, but that's just the way that the figures have come out. Against these figures, we also need to ensure we maintain a 5-year supply of housing plus an appropriate buffer. Now, the appropriate buffer ranges from 5% to 20%, depending on how strong delivery has been in the area. Because delivery has been strong for the last 3 years, we have to apply a 5% buffer to our figures. And I'm going to skip around a little bit, but if I can take you to page 24 on the printed agenda, that is our latest calculation of housing land supply, and that stands at 6.89 years. So that's comfortably above the 5-year housing requirement. Now, if we were falling below the 5-year housing requirement, we would be in that position where we would need to consider development on its merits, even if it's against the development plan. We're not in that position. We can give full weight to the development plan. But if good proposals outside of the settlement boundaries come forward before the council, it doesn't stop the council from approving them if there are good reasons to do so. On the other token, we are not forced by the development industry to accept sites that are outside of the local plan and not needed to meet our housing requirements. If I can then draw attention to the trajectory that is on page 21 of the published agenda, and what this chart shows is, in blue, number of homes delivered each year in the years since 2013-14, and then in the sort of buff or orangey colour, the projection of how many dwellings are expected to be delivered in the years to the end of the local plan period, 2033. And what you will see from that is in those first 3 years, very low performance against the requirement, and in subsequent years we have been above the requirement each year, such that we are now 111 over where we need to be at this point in the plan period, which, if you average it out over the 9 years that have we've been monitoring this for, that's about 12 dwellings a year above target if you average it out. So we're, you know, it's manageable. It's just above where we need to be. In the buff colour going forward, all of these figures are based on an assessment which is contained within background papers that are available online, the Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment, which looks at all of the larger sites with planning permission or that are allocated in the local plan, and includes an estimate of how many are expected to be delivered in coming years. Now, in making that judgment on each site, what we do is we consult relevant developers to ask their views and their opinion on what the trajectory is going forward. On other sites, we make a bit of a judgment based on rates of development that have been achieved in those areas in the past. But we also have an eye on the future as well, and what might happen with the economy. And more often than not, with my estimation, conservatively small c, in terms of what may happen on certain sites, so that we're not left in a position where we've been over optimistic and could fall into a position where we've overestimated it and we end up with no 5-year supply. So we always apply them cautiously, conservatively. We've been complimented on that generally in our performance on appeal of late, and we were complimented and upheld in doing so by the planning inspector that dealt with the local plan examination. On the point around small sites, and Mr. Marshall, in his statement, made a relevant point that the trajectory going forward does rely increasingly heavily on the larger allocations of land coming forward, such as the garden community on the boundary with Colchester, Hartley Gardens on the northern side of Clacton, and some of the other larger sites, Wheatley being an example as well, which Councillor Harris will be familiar with, and some of the larger sites with development potential. But there will be a supply of smaller sites coming through, but I think it's reasonable what Mr. Marshall has said, that is a diminishing resource, those smaller sites. We make an estimation in our figures of what we expect to come forward on those small windfall sites. We still think it's a healthy number. We still believe that we will achieve the figure that's been set out in the local plan, and we have actually put on page 19 a paragraph in here that responds to that specific point around small sites. That April 22, there remains an expectation that 943 dwellings will be built on the smaller schemes of 9 or fewer dwellings, and there are planning permissions already in place for 686. So I don't think they're completely dried up. There is an expectation that we will see a fair number of smaller sites coming forward. It's an issue to keep under review, because we do need to review the local plan within a 5-year time period, and depending on how much additional housing we are required to plan for going longer term, and bearing in mind government guidance changes and you might have to plan for different figures going forward, we may have to consider different options for how that housing is delivered. Is it more large sites? Is it more smaller sites? Is it a combination of the two? These are things that we need to keep under review, and if we need to respond in policy terms, the time to do that is through the local plan review. And in doing so, if we do come to a view at some point in the future that more small sites are required, at that point, I think serious consideration would need to be given to the use of community infrastructure levy, which is a means by which all sites, irrespective of their size, can contribute towards the infrastructure needs of the district. What I would say in response to some of Mr. Marshall's specific points about the 5 dwellings that have permission in Ardley. Obviously, Ardley is only 1/27th of the parish area of our district, and of course, if you multiply that up, there are a number of small site schemes coming forward in our area, and Mr. Marshall may or may not be aware that Ardley have recently been consulting on their neighbourhood plan, where the general consensus is that they don't want to see a much more residential development take place in the parish, and of course part of the garden community falls within the parish of Ardley as well, and there has been a fair amount of development in Ardley in the past as well. The Fox Street DRPP, the deliverable plan of the public. Thank you, Mr. Marshall. I wanted to make sure I got that right. Was an alternative proposal to the garden community that was put forward as part of the local plan examination. The council decided not to go with that proposal in favour of the garden community through the review of the local plan. If there is such a need, if there is such a demand to look at a proposal like that again, of course we can do at that point, and I'm sure Mr. Marshall will look forward to that opportunity to put that forward. I don't think there are any other points I raise in response to Mr. Marshall's suggestions, and I hope he appreciates and understands why we've said that. Development has been strong over the 21-22 period, and I think councillors, residents in all part of the district have seen that on the ground, that there's been a lot of development come forward. Some notable schemes: Flint Grange, Little Clacton, Williamsburg Avenue in the Parkston Harwich area, Finch's Park and the Laurels in Kirby Cross. I think I could name a scheme in everybody's ward that has come forward in recent times, and I think the fact that we can now bring housing delivery under a bit more control by having an up-to-date local plan and a 5-year supply in place is a very important thing. And Chairman, before my voice packs up, if I could refer you to the recommendation, which is on page 16 of the agenda.
Thank you very much, Mr. Guyver. Mr. Marshall, are you satisfied with those answers, or would you like something in writing to you? This is the next speaker I'm going to call. I leave you to deal with that. It's beyond my remit. Councillor White, as chairman of the planning committee, you may comment before I go to the recommendation. Do you have any comments? Right, thank you very much indeed. And that being the case, I go to the recommendation as said on page 16, that the local plan committee endorses the contents of this report, notes that the new strategic housing land assessment. Oh, that's a good point. Yeah. I will do that here. Linked to the background document, demonstrates an up-to-date housing land supply and for the purposes of determining planning applications and contesting planning appeals. Do I have any questions? Councillor Bush, then I'll take Councillor Chapman.
Thank you, Chairman. And first of all, thank you very much, Mr. Guyver, for another comprehensive report and demonstrating the confidence and how strong delivery has been, particularly over the last 2-3 years. It's not really looking back now, it's looking forward. Do we maintain that minimum and beyond? I know the projections, but I do have concerns what the current economic climate has now evolved. We're seeing mortgages being pulled. We're seeing major issues with construction costs. And one of the big points for me is, I don't know, I think you've referred to it, we're not dependent on the Tender and Garden borders or Hartley Gardens as a contribution to meet that target, which is good news for that respect. But I'm concerned that, the frequency that we monitor this, how often are we going to monitor the performance, because we don't want to get too far down the line before we try to make major adjustments and be seen to be accepting plan applications that we wouldn't have to in another situation. So they're really the big things. And obviously the other thing for me is what we're seeing in the marketplace is land purchase, being struggled with developers, to get what they want for it and what they're being paid. Is this going to stop and slow down this whole process? I fear for that. And that's really for confidence is prudent. Can we have a little bit more stricter monitoring, reviewing of how our phasing and the programme is working? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman.
Sorry, thank you, Councillor Bush. Mr. Guyver.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Councillor Bush. Yeah, no, excellent points to raise. In terms of frequency of monitoring, we do this return on an annual basis. But what certainly happened in the past, and we would certainly do this again, is that if it looks like our performance against the 5-year requirement is dipping and it's getting closer to that critical 5-year position, we can do a more frequent calculation, and sometimes we're required to do that if we are faced with a planning application that has gone to appeal and the developer is minded to take the council to task over its housing figures. Under those circumstances, and we have had that in the past, we have done an interim report halfway or a quarter away through the year if the position it looks like it's changing rapidly. Hopefully at 6.85 we would expect next year will probably be okay, but depending on what happens with the economy and how that impacts on delivery, if it looks like next year it's dipping close to the critical point, then we might up the frequency of the monitoring of it, and we might actually be faced with applications that do go to appeal, with the developers seeking to sort of exploit that marginal position. So it's a judgment call at the time, but that would be the test for me. If it looks like it's dipping and it looks like we're going to be facing appeals, we'll do a more frequent assessment and a more frequent return. Just a general comment on economics. I've got some experience of dealing with appeals where the applicant has argued that because the economy is weak and the housing market is fragile, the best thing to do is to release a load of other sites into the mix for development. Now, I have experience of arguing successfully the opposite, on the basis that simply increasing the supply of land doesn't always translate into an increase of delivery, because whatever economic conditions are impinging on the developments that are failing to deliver will be the same economic conditions that will impact upon those developers that argue they can get their schemes off the ground. And numerous times we were proven correct that sites that obtained planning permission on appeal, and I look at Councillor Coley because there is a particular site in Councillor Coley's area that was granted permission at a time when we couldn't demonstrate a 5-year supply on the promise that it would help to fill the gap. That development has only just started, and we've been in a position where we've been able to demonstrate a 5-year supply for a couple of years now. So the argument about the economy going down the plan and us needing to release more sites is one that I take cautiously. Sometimes it might be true if the specific sites that you've got in your mix have got problems associated with them, but it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. I think developers that argue that, I think they have to be tested, and we've got success in doing so in the past. But I'm waffling now, but hopefully you understand the point that economic decline on its own does not justify releasing more supply into the market. We have to look at the circumstances around it. Thank you.
Wish to come back, Councillor Bush? No, right. Thank you very much, Councillor Chapman.
Thank you, Chairman. actually Councillor Bush has said on availability of building we're in now, but you've answered that. Something I'm going to jump in on. You mentioned the Flint Grange development. I'm going to have to declare a personal interest in Flint Grange.
Fine, well, you can still speak on it if you wish to.
No, that I just needed to.
Okay,
I wasn't
fine.
something I
Noted.
needed to declare now you mentioned
Okay,
it.
lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Harris.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Can I ask the officer, the housing trajectory graph, does that include any windfall numbers?
Thank you. It does. It includes an allowance for windfall, and that allowance is based on essentially what's got permission, what the rate of delivery on windfall sites, and for the purposes of these calculations, we're talking about the smaller windfall sites, 9 or fewer dwellings. So it's based on a projection of how well we've delivered in the past, but taking into account what is already in the supply in terms of planning permissions. And the figure that I quoted from page 19, which is that we have an expectation that 943 dwellings will be built on small schemes. That 943 is scattered amongst the figures in those green columns, the buff columns on the trajectory. So yes, they are included.
Thank you. I mean,
Would you like a supplementary?
Oh, supplementary. I was just going to make
Follow through.
Okay, follow through. You know, being a member of the planning community, obviously the local plan was something that we were all delighted to see, and brings about an end to speculative house building that communities didn't want in certain areas. But you know, if I can reassure Mr. Marshall that we view each application on its own merits, and then our last planning committee meeting, we actually approved 26 homes which were windfall houses, and that was in Great Bentley. Now, whilst it was within the development boundary, they were numbers that weren't specifically mentioned, but they go into into the numbers. So I really just wanted to say that we look at each application on its own merits. But I can think of another one in Great Bromley, where there was 100 plus, and that was against officers actually recommendation on that. But the committee looked at it, went with the local parish council, who actually wanted that to go ahead as well. And we thought that it was, we judged it on its own merits, and we believed that was the right thing to do. So there will be more that come through, I am sure. Thank you.
Do I have any more? Sorry. Do I have any more questions or queries? No? Then I'll move to the recommendation as stated earlier. And are all those in favour, please show. I'll propose your second. Thank you. Actually, now, right, moving on to number 7, I believe. Page 25. Yep, item A2, conservation area character appraisal and management plans. The second part of tonight's agenda is for the conservation area of Great Oakley and Kirby Lasoken. Thank you, Councillor Coley. Good night. We are asked to comment and recommend to the Cabinet that these be published for consultation with the public and any other interested parties. Further, this committee will receive 8 more character appraisals and management plans over the next 6 months, i.e. by the end of this, I always said Parliament, it's council. No, we're getting above ourselves, aren't we? Right, so if that's the case, once more, Mr. Guyver.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman. So the as similar to previous meetings, we've been bringing forward a series of conservation area character appraisals and management plans before the committee for their consideration before going on to Cabinet to approve for consultation. There are 20 conservation areas in our district in total, and they are designated for their special historic and architectural character. And in designating conservation areas, the council has a duty in making decisions on planning to have regard to that special character in making those decisions, and to seek to preserve and enhance that special character in taking those decisions. But there are also restrictions that go with the designation of conservation area and what you can and can't do. For example, on demolition of certain structures needs permission from the council, whereas outside conservation area it wouldn't, and certain works to trees as well, which wouldn't normally require permission, do if you're in a conservation area. And there are other implications as well. In being there to protect the special and historic and architectural character, protection is also afforded to the setting of those conservation areas as well. So if you have a development proposal that is on the edge or outside of, but could have an impact on that special character, that's something that the council has to take into account as well. So of the 20 conservation areas in our area, 10 have already been before this committee and onto Cabinet for approval to go out to consultation. And my colleague has been in Brightlingsea today, actually, on one of the conservation area events associated with this piece of work, encouraging people to go along and put forward their thoughts on these documents. So these documents are useful for a number of reasons. One is it is recommended as part of the council's own heritage strategy that we update all of the information we have in relation to these conservation areas. I think they're of significant public interest, really, for the people and communities and businesses that live in those areas, and for the various historic societies and organisations that do what they can to promote and help to protect the special character of these areas. But they provide a practical function as well. And the practical function is, if we are protecting conservation areas for their special characteristics, understanding what those special characteristics are is a good starting point. And these documents help very well to encapsulate that so that we can have regard to these as a material planning consideration. The two before you tonight relate to Great Oakley and to Kirby Le Soken, which means that there's another 8 to go, which we're, as the chairman rightly said, we're looking to bring before this committee in the coming months. I'm not intending to go in great detail through each one, but to just highlight some of the things that these documents set out. So the Great Oakley one, which starts on page 34 of your agenda, they follow a similar format as has been the case for the previous ones. So a general introduction of the area, the boundary of the area, and some of the key aspects, a general description about the rules around conservation areas and what's managed by them and what people can do to find out whether they live in a conservation area. And if I go forward to page 43 of this particular agenda, the context and character of the area, followed, if you flick through the documents, a description of the prehistoric, Roman, early medieval, post-medieval history, and some interesting maps showing the evolution of those settlements through the years. These conservation area appraisals provide the opportunity to consider whether a change to the boundary is required in relation to Great Oakley. You'll see on page 49 of your agenda that no change is recommended for this particular conservation area. But then it goes on to comment on some of the designated heritage assets. So we're talking about listed buildings formerly are key to the character of the area. And there's some photographs in there showing some of those. And it goes on later on to look at some of the non-designated heritage assets. And you'll recall, Chairman, members, that alongside these conservation area reviews, we're inviting suggestions for buildings and structures to be added to the non-statutory list, which allows those structures and buildings to also be given a degree of protection through the planning process. Page 55 of this particular one, an assessment of significance. Now, significance is an important word that we use in heritage planning because you are required to consider what the significance of a asset is or a conservation area is in making planning decisions, because depending on its significance will have a bearing on what type of things you can approve and you can't approve. So you need to bear that in mind. And this provides a description of the significance of the Great Oakley conservation areas and pulls out some of the specific features. So on page 59, for example, the use of weatherboarding in particular areas of the village is a particular thing that is part of the vernacular for that area, as we call it. And flicking through the document further actually provides commentary from page 62 on key unlisted buildings. So buildings that might not be listed on the National Register, but that have merit for protection in their own right. Commentary on specific views within the conservation area, page 65. Which are followed up with commentary and relative photographs from page 66, 67 and onwards. And there's some commentary on some modern development, where we see development, not really particularly necessarily, but certainly since the core development of Great Oak's been more modern forms of development on the outskirts, and there's some commentary on the contribution they make or don't make to the general character of the area. If you went to page 72, there are commentary about the opportunities for enhancing conservation areas, and that might be around some of the alterations to buildings that perhaps haven't been that complementary in the past. And there are sort of relevant photographs there. Councillor Bush will be very familiar with all of these buildings and photographs, I'm sure. Towards the end of all of these documents, and I bring your attention to page 82, for example, on this one, there are recommendations for the short, medium and longer term for the council to consider and take on board in whichever way it considers appropriate, resources pending, of course, and adding to the local list of buildings is one of the recommendations, making sure that the information is out there for people within conservation areas, so they're aware of their obligations in that regard is one of those. There's commentary on the approach to shop frontages, tree management, the public realm, which may be things that are taken on board if, for example, the parish were to prepare a neighbourhood plan for its area. These kind of recommendations can be taken on board not only by the district council in undertaking its obligations, also parishes in neighbourhood plan. But there's a whole wealth of information in all of these conservation area appraisals, and similarly with Kirby Le Soken, which starts on page 99 of the agenda, and it follows exactly the same format, including the context of the area. For Kirby the Soken, there is actually a recommended alteration to the boundary of the area, which seeks to include some areas, but remove others. So including areas that are considered to be valuable to the character of the area that weren't considered to be such in the past, and also areas that perhaps don't contribute that much to the sense of character in the area and that perhaps should be removed. Page 108 of your agenda onwards provides that evolution through the years, through prehistoric through to modern times. And there's some interesting observations about the history of the church within the document. You'll see here a 14th century church, which is pretty much 19th century. Is sort of current configuration. But there are still sort of remains of the historic windows, the 14th century version in the past. Historic maps of Kirby the Soken, page 114, 115, showing maps and the proposed extension and reduction to the area that's included within the designation. Assessment of significance from page 117 onwards. And again, as with Great Oakley, as you flick through the document, it highlights some of the more notable buildings within the village of Kirby the Soken, highlights some of the particular characteristics, postbox and telephone kiosk on the green, more modern development that's taken place in the area and the contribution that they make. The page 130 specific commentary on the church, the countryside around Kirby the Soken is the setting is particularly relevant. The agrarian character, as they call it, sort of the history around agriculture in the surrounding area, which has informed the boundary and the level of protection that is proposed. And like the other assessment towards the end, there are a number of suggested recommendations for the short, medium and long term as to how to ensure that this area continues to be protected in the future. As has been the case for the first 10, the recommendation here is that we consult the communities, consult relevant historic societies, preservation trusts, and anybody else that has an interest in the character and the importance of the protection, preservation, conservation of those areas to comment on the content of these documents. And as has been the case in the past, we've been able to and invited suggestions in advance of the consultation happening to see if there are any tweaks, improvements we can make to the documents before they're published for the consultation. And I'm sure the chair will endorse that we continue to do that for these as well. So in summary, we have 2 further conservation area appraisals before you tonight, and the recommendation is mainly a reference to Cabinet to agree to their publication, but the recommendation, Chairman, which I'll invite you to endorse with the committee tonight, and I'm happy to respond to any questions or comments on this or suggestions. I did have it before me, but it is on one. Thank you very much, Chairman. Page 25, Chairman, I'll hand back to you for the recommendation.
Much, Mr. Guyver, for once, as always, a very thorough and comprehensive overview. Do I have any questions? Councillor Winfield. Sorry, I take Councillor Winfield first. Thank you.
On page 143.
Hang on.
If it's in a conservation area, does that mean you cannot have double glazing? Is that if you own a place there? And because on there it's got Does that mean the same as it's listed?
It's not as strict as it is for a listed building. And you'll recall when we had conversations in the past about whether we wanted to use Article 4 directions to remove rights for what can and can't, what you can and can't do in conservation areas. That was something that we're keeping under review to see whether it's relevant to any of these conservation areas going forward. But no, there's still a fair amount you can still do in terms of improvements and changes to windows. But what we're suggesting here is that if people are minded to make improvements, then they should consult the council, and we can recommend particular forms of windows, doors that are appropriate in a conservation area. But a lot of that can depend on whether people know that they're in a conservation area and whether they're aware of those obligations.
Satisfied, Councillor Wentworth? Good. Councillor Bush, the floor is yours.
Yeah, first of all, Mr. Grove, thanks ever so much again for your presentation. I must say that when I read through this document, I was quite impressed with some of the history that I'd found, which I wasn't aware of. Having looked for it and spoken with a number of residents that have got a lot of historical knowledge, and many people that live in these listed buildings too. One of the questions is, when you say consultation, first question is, how are we going to consult? Are we going to go and visit and do a presentation at a village hall? How's that going to be done? That's the first question. And secondly, it does say that there's no reason to adjust the conservation boundary. Now, when you look at the historic maps of Great Oakley, in particular to the south of where Farm Road is, there are medieval properties that there, in particular like Norman Cottage or Moses Farm and Gay House, which sit on that edge and were excluded. Now they are, as far as I'm aware, they're listed anyway as well. And there is no mention of, which I thought is very, very important. And people in Great Oakley always talk about Pest Workhouse Corner, which was an old workhouse that goes back in Victorian times, and the original cottage, which goes back to about 1600. It was occupied by the people that managed the workhouse, and there's no reference to that at all in any way. And it is very significant because people all talk about the historic workhouse that was once there. There are other buildings or other areas which are, I think, are not designated, but should maybe considered for this. Like, we have a Victorian water pump in Red Barn Lane that just sits there. Well, on it, I bet it's a great report to look at what we're finding, and speaking to many residents and some of the parish, that they're keen to have some engagement during that consultation period to offer what they can as something they may have missed. And one of the things that's popped up when I was reading the detail regarding, I think it was in page, where are we? Yes, page 56 was one. It mentions Brightlingsea. I think that's a typo. Okay. And another point which I think is very crucial as well, I don't know how updated the designated heritage assets are on the websites. Maltings Farmhouse, grade 2 listed, part of this it's a designated heritage asset. It says this house and ancillary building now a restaurant and flat. Well, it hasn't been that for 20 odd years. It's a house and it's been returned back. Used to be a restaurant back in the 80s. So I don't know how that could be addressed on that data, because when I speak to the people at Maltings Farmhouse, they might be a little bit concerned with that. Okay, but other than that, there's so much in here to look at, and I'm looking forward to the consultation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Councillor Bush. No, I welcome all sort of comments about the conservation area, because our colleagues in Essex Place Services have got a huge amount of information that they've managed to draw upon, and they're very good at what they do, and they presented these documents beautifully. But they will be the first ones to tell you that there's no substitute for that on the ground local knowledge that needs to feed into this. And I think they will be very welcoming of any comments from local residents, businesses, the parish, any local history societies, because they're not cited on everything in respect to the history of Great Oakley. And you've given a handful of examples there that prove that. So certainly these are things that I can feed back to Place Services in the run up to them doing the consultation, because they may be able to add a little bit more in before we get to that consultation stage. But if there are other comments that will help to strengthen these documents, that's the purpose of the consultation. We don't have all the information, but there are definitely people in your towns and villages that most certainly do have that information, and that needs to be passed from generation to generation. And this is perfect opportunity to encapsulate that. The nature of the consultation is to write to people in those areas to let them know when we're going to be in the village. We've been booking halls in the village, and Place Services experts with our own officers have been there to receive people coming in, to make suggestions and to present some of the photographs and diagrams on boards, and they're in Brightlingsea today doing that, and the intention would be to do that for Great Oakley and for Kirkby Le Soken as well. So very much getting into the heart of the community. Just a couple of comments further to the comments on listed buildings and buildings that aren't listed. One of the things that I would say is that if people have suggestions for structures or buildings to go on to the non-designated heritage site, they don't necessarily have to be confined to sites within these conservation areas. So if there are dwellings or structures, buildings outside of these areas, we could still consider them for inclusion on the list. It just so happens when you've got a conservation area that there are a lot of buildings of merit that may deserve to go on the list. And certainly that feedback, that real life feedback, Maltings Farmhouse, it's spoken in here as a restaurant and flat. It's not. Let's feed that back to Place Services, and we can make sure that it is accurate going forward. And the reference to Brightlingsea is clearly a typographical one, and we'll pick that up and make sure that's corrected, and we'll give it a good thorough proofreading before it goes out to consultation, I'm sure.
Any other comments? No. I invite Councillor White to, if you'd like to, if you have any further comments. Sorry, would you mind? We are being broadcast.
Right.
Thank you.
It did this last time. Yeah, all I will say to Councillor Bush, we've been through the exercise in St Joseph, and it's exactly as Gary has said. We came up with a lot of suggested alterations, all of which have been added in. So all I can say to him really is get all your information together and get it in before the document's finally ratified. Get it in as soon as you can.
Thank you very much, Councillor White. Appreciate it. Yes, just for sake of it's Brightlingsea today. It's Harwich Old Town on the 13th. That's at the Harwich Masonic Hall, 42 Ferndale Road. It's my patch on 14th of October, Friday. That's at the Columbine Centre, Prince's Esplanade, Walton on the Naze. And then it's over to you, Jane, the Councillor Chapman, on the 19th of October. And that is being held at the Village Hall, Plough Road. And then finally, for this batch, Manningtree and Missley is at Foundry Court, Colchester Road, and that's on the 20th of October. all from 3 till 7. And I will certainly be putting my head in on Friday at the Columbines. Very important. Before I go to the recommendations, I would like the committee to consider this. I'm pleased that this committee and our officers are progressing so well with the review of our conservation areas, and with the rest to come by the end of this municipal year. I'm also pleased that we've been able to write specifically to properties in each of the respective areas to promote these important consultation activities. And despite this, it strikes me from the things I have seen both in my ward and other areas, there are still many residents and businesses with properties in our conservation areas who may be completely unaware of their location in areas of special architectural and historical character, and the fact there are certain responsibilities and controls placed upon them in the respect of development. As we have demonstrated, that is possible to identify the properties that lie within each conservation area. We're aiming to have undertaken a consultation in each of these 20 areas by the time our council tax bills go out in 2023. I would like to suggest to the Cabinet that we prepare a simple leaflet on conservation areas and their purpose and their implications, and that this is printed in time to go out with the council tax bill to all properties in those conservation areas. Communication information is a key part of this council's adopted heritage strategy, and I think this leaflet will support the objectives of that strategy. I believe that would answer some of your questions, Councillor Winfield. With members' blessing, and I put this through, so what I will do is I'll read out what we have in front of us here in our document, and then I'll add this one in as item 4. So we have before us 1, endorse the new conservation area appraisal and management plans for Great Oakley, Appendix 1, Kirby Lasoken, Appendix 2, conservation area. 2 recommends to Cabinet that the above documents forming Appendices 1 and 2 be published for consultation with the public and other interested parties. And 3 notes the conservation area appraisal and management plans for districts. Other unreviewed conservations will be brought to the committee in due course over the next 6 months. And item 4, the addition would be this. We recommend to Cabinet that a leaflet be produced by officers for the residents of properties in all conservation areas and areas proposed through the conservation area reviews to be included in the conservation areas to inform residents in basic terms of the purpose, implications and controls in relation to conservation area status, and that these leaflets be distributed to the relevant households with the 2023 council tax bill. Got any comments on that or any questions they would like to ask? Councillor Bush.
Yeah. Regarding the final document, all this, or the rectified document, will that come after the consultation, or was that going to be produced between now and then, and that's going to be it to the presentation in the community? Or all that's done at consultation, will you take back the feedback then to finalise it? Anything's going to be added? That's really the question.
The Guyver.
Thank you, Councillor Bush. A bit of both, actually, because we've been quite flexible on our approach with this. If there are immediate comments that on perhaps publication of this report for this committee or through discussions with local residents, things that they've spotted, we're happy to take those comments now, feed them back to Place Services to see if there is time for them to incorporate them before we publish the document for formal consultation. But of course, through the formal consultation, if there are further comments that come through, those will be taken into account, which may result in other changes being made before we look to finalise the documents and bring them back for ratification. So there's 2 bites of the cherry available on these, and we've been quite flexible in that approach.
Councillor Bush, are you happy with that? Thank you. Councillor Harris.
Question to you, please, Chairman. The leaflet that you are proposing, will it be specific, like we've spoken about Great Oakley? There'll be a leaflet tailored for those addresses in Great Oakley. It won't be one general leaflet that goes out. It will be specific to that area and those addresses that are actually in it.
Yeah, what it will be is we've now been able to drill down in our postage. Instead of sending it out to all 70-odd thousand hang on, how many 22 we got? 50 odd, isn't it? I know it should be, and I can't think of. No, I was thinking about across the district. Instead of doing a blanket across to every ratepayer in the district, this will be to only those who live within conservation areas. Because I don't know whether any of you do live in a conservation area, but I do, and I got this letter, sent through it, and email. I got an email, and I got this letter to concern. Anyway, that's beside the point. It doesn't matter. But it reads: "We are writing to you as you've previously shown interest in planning policy matters." Have I? Within district, or you live in one of the conservation areas. It goes on and then explains it all to you. And that's what we've all received. What we can do is, rather than if your neighbour isn't in a conservation area, he will not receive the leaflet.
So it's a general leaflet that's going out
just to those living in conservation areas.
So across all of the whole of the district, they've got those in the conservation. They will all get the same leaflet.
That's right.
Great. Thank you.
And then we're going to, the other thing is, if you've read the recommendations at the back here, I mean, that's something I haven't informed Mr. Guyver of yet because we haven't discussed it. That I was looking for us to see if we can give some form of guidance. This will be for the next council, really, to where you can access what is. I mean, for instance, there's a loathing of UVPC, and I'm certainly, I know Councillor White there's nodding vigorously because he's got the biggest Grade 1 listed collection of dwellings, I think, in the country, isn't it? In one small area, something like that. There's this loathing of UVPC by place services, but equally so, one has to take into account the economics of the householder and the availability. And I know myself, because if you've got a business in a conservation area, you have to replace like with like. There's no, you have to do that. And when I had my business in a conservation area in Frinton, the windows I had in my hotel were, I've never seen better. Beautiful windows, profiles this thick. Not bloody great things you've got nowadays. And if you work out the square footage on that, which I'm certain Councillor Bush has, you realise how much light has been taken away from you. But these were obviously specifically made for that building, and you could not replace them. They say Crittles, well, Crittles, you know, it's like comparing a Ford to a Bentley in comparison. So, I mean, it was, and I spent 3 years with windows rattling, people moaning about bloody drafts in their bedrooms and God knows what else, before I could eventually one of Mr. Guyver's predecessors took pity on me and carefully led me along the line. I found what I wanted. Now, rather than people having to go through that, our follow-up will be that we'll find a selection of alternatives that we can offer any householder who gets in touch. This wouldn't be proactive, this would be reactive, i.e. we would respond if they asked. But I do think that's important because it is very difficult. You know, you have a budget, you settle it down, you think, oh, come on, we can afford to put an extension on. We're going to afford to, you know, do this. And then suddenly somebody says, oh, no, you can't do that. So I think it's only reasonable we do that. And on that basis, may I ask for, if everybody accepts, may I ask for a proposer? Thank you very much, Councillor Bush, a seconder. Thank you very much, Councillor Chapman. All those in favour, please show. Thank you very much. That's unanimous. Thank you very much indeed. Our next meeting is the last item on the agenda to be decided. ASAP, please, Mr. Guyver. And thank you all very much for coming. And I close this meeting at 7:20. Enjoy that.